I watched him from across the table, and in the exact second while he was delivering the question with the smile of a man who already knows the answer and is using the question as a weapon, I understood that everything I was about to say was going to land wrong. Not because the words were wrong, because the room was wrong, because the moment had been chosen wrong. Because my father, Mark Collins, was not asking me anything. He was performing. He sat at the head of the table the way he always sat at the head of the table, with that particular quality of physical presence that occupies a room before the body has fully settled into it. The quality of a man who has spent 20 years being the loudest signal in every space he enters and has stopped noticing that he does it. It was August. The air in the dining room was heavy with the smell of food my mother had been preparing since morning, with the particular warmth of a room containing too many bodies, with the loosened, softened atmosphere of people who had already had wine and food and felt comfortable enough to let their guard down slightly, which in my family was always the most dangerous moment, because comfortable people say the things they've been half thinking without the friction of caution to slow them down. There were 12 of us at the table. My Uncle Henry and his wife, 2 cousins, Patrick Simmons, who had been my father's business associate for so long that he had stopped registering as a guest and had become a kind of permanent fixture at family events, a man who laughed at my father's jokes a half-beat earlier than anyone else, and who had the specific social fluency of someone who understood that loyalty to powerful people performed consistently over years is its own form of currency. My older brother Derek, sitting to my father's right with the expression he wore when he anticipated something useful happening for him. My mother, Pamela Collins, at the other end of the table in the position she always occupied, proximate to my father in the organizational sense, attending carefully to everything, saying less than she knew. And Lauren sitting next to me, her shoulder almost touching mine, who was the only person at that table who knew what I was about to say, and who was the only person at that table who understood what it meant. I was 18 years old. My father said, not asked, said, in the declarative register of a man who already knows the answer and is using the question to demonstrate his knowledge of it. So, which university did you end up deciding on? And everything was in that word, so, in the assumption embedded before the question had technically begun. Of course you decided. Of course you chose. Of course you are walking down the path I have laid out for you, without asking whether it was the path you wanted. So is the word of a man who is closing a question before opening it, who is using the grammatical form of an inquiry to perform the certainty that no real inquiry is needed. It is a word that requires you to fit yourself inside of it before you can answer it, and if you cannot fit yourself inside of it, then the problem is you, not the word. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, set it back down. I was telling myself to be calm, to be clear, to lay out the thing I had prepared to say and say it the way I had rehearsed it in my room, the careful logical sequence of it, the acknowledgement of their concern, before the presentation of the evidence. I had thought about this conversation more times than I could count. I had rehearsed it in the shower, at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling, during the long drives I took when I needed to think. I had imagined my father's resistance and prepared for it. I had imagined his skepticism and built responses to it. What I had not fully imagined in any of my rehearsals was the specific quality of public exposure. 12 people, food half eaten, wine poured, a room that had no interest in my carefully prepared logical sequence, and every interest in what it could make of my discomfort. I said, I'm not applying to universities. I've been building a project for almost 2 years that has real customer interest, and I've made the decision to continue working on it instead of going away to school right now. I'd like to sit down with you separately and show you everything in detail. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then the laughter, not explosive, not mean in any obvious theatrical sense, Worse, the quiet, dismissive kind. The kind that doesn't require articulation because it is itself the articulation. The sound of people deciding that something is so clearly beneath serious engagement that the only appropriate response is amusement. My uncle made a sound through his nose. One of my cousins looked at his plate. Patrick Simmons raised an eyebrow in the way of someone watching something predictably awkward unfold. My mother, who could read my father's face faster than anyone at that table, folded her hands quietly in her lap. And then my father said it. He said, "Disgrace," not in a whisper. In his full dining room voice, the one he used when he needed the room to understand where he stood, which he deployed with the same precision he deployed everything, not from rage, because rage would have been messier and less controlled, and my father was never less than controlled in public, but from a place of settled, certain judgment. He said it with the weight of a man delivering a verdict he has thought about carefully and found completely justified. He said that no son of his was going to sit at this table, and announced that he had decided to throw away his future for a childish hobby. He put the word hobby into the sentence the way you insert a blade, precisely at the angle that does the most damage. He said that he had worked for 20 years building something real so that his sons would have options in this life, real options, and that sitting across from him right now was a young man who had apparently decided that 20 years of his father's work was worth less than some fantasy he'd cooked up in his bedroom. My mother said, not loudly, almost to herself, the way she said things when she was speaking to manage the situation, rather than to express anything genuine. She said that I'd embarrassed the family. And then Derek, who had been patient, who had been sitting with the patience of someone who has rehearsed their own moment, and was waiting for exactly the right beat, who had probably spent the drive over to this dinner, calculating when his line would land best. Derek said pleasantly, with a warmth in his voice that was the exact inverse of warmth, "Dreamers end up begging." He said it with something that resembled sympathy, the kind of sympathy that is contempt in a better suit. He said it the way you say something you've known for a long time, and are finally being given the opportunity to make public, the way you deliver a truth you've been carrying patiently, waiting for the moment when delivering it would do the most work. Lauren didn't say anything. She put her hand on my knee under the table once, briefly, not to communicate anything she wanted the room to see, just the private, honest gesture of someone who is present with you in a way that has nothing to do with the performance happening around her. Then she took it away. I don't know if anyone noticed. I noticed, I have been noticing it, in the memory of that moment, for 12 years. I did not fight back. I want to spend a moment on that, because the decision not to fight back in that moment is one that people sometimes interpret incorrectly when I tell this story. They assume it was dignity or wisdom or some mature, strategic calculation about not escalating. It was none of those things. I was 18 years old, and I had just been publicly humiliated by my father, laughed at by my extended family, and dismissed by my brother in front of the person I cared most about. And what I felt in that moment was the specific species of pain that arrives when something you have built carefully in private is taken out of your hands and smashed in front of an audience as a demonstration of someone else's power. I was not calm. The calm was performance. Underneath the performance was something that was shaking. I said quietly that I understood how this looked to them, and that I hoped to be able to show them something different. No one responded directly. My father said something to my uncle. The conversation moved on. I sat at that table for another 45 minutes and did not speak. The drive home afterward was quiet in the specific way that a space becomes quiet when two people are each processing something too large to begin discussing without knowing where to start. Lauren drove. She had driven us there in her car, the one she had paid for herself by working through her first 2 years of college. She drove the way she did most things, with complete, focused attention, one hand on the wheel, the radio off, At a red light, she looked at me. She didn't say that it was going to be okay. She didn't say that they were wrong. She said, "Tell me what you need right now." I told her I needed to not talk about it for an hour. She nodded. She drove. An hour later, parked outside the building where I lived, we talked until after midnight. She asked me every serious question she had about the project. Not the surface questions, not the encouraging ones, but the real ones. The ones about customer acquisition cost and timeline, and what happened if the first 2 customers changed their minds, and whether I had accounted for the possibility that I had underestimated the technical complexity of what I was trying to build. She pushed back where pushing back was warranted. She told me she thought I had something real and that the real question was not whether the product worked, but whether the business around it would hold. She told me I needed to think harder about my structural vulnerabilities than I had. She was 20 years old, 2 years older than me, studying business administration 40 minutes away, and she was the clearest thinker I'd ever been in a room with. She believed in it. I want to make sure that's clear, because it matters for everything that follows. Lauren Mitchell believed in what I was building, and her belief was not the emotional, unexamined kind that people perform when they love someone and want to support them. It was the kind of belief that comes from actually looking at the thing, taking it apart, testing its assumptions, identifying the places where it could fail, and then concluding that it was nonetheless worth pursuing. She had done that work. She believed in the result of the work. That was the last evening that had any ordinary warmth in it for a long time. Within 48 hours, my father called me into the small office he kept at the house, the room with the filing cabinets and the degrees on the wall, the room he used as a stage for formal communications, and informed me, in language that was clipped and precise and entirely free of the emotional register you might expect from a father talking to his son, that my involvement with the family business was terminated. My involvement had been peripheral and informal. Some summer work, some data entry, occasional shadowing of operations, the kind of ambient proximity to a family business that is offered to sons without ever being made official. All of it was done. He said this was not a punishment. He said it was practical, since I had apparently decided to pursue my own direction. The word apparently was doing something in that sentence. It was treating my decision as a kind of performance rather than a real thing, a pose rather than a conclusion I had reached after 18 months of genuine work. I did not argue with him. I thanked him for telling me directly. Within 4 days, the shared credit card I had carried for emergencies was canceled. I found out when I tried to buy food at a grocery store, and the card was declined. I stood at the register and looked at the terminal for a moment, and then paid cash from what I had in my wallet and walked out. Within 6 days, my father requested the return of the car, a 4-year-old sedan registered in his name that I had been driving for 2 years, that I had maintained and fueled and treated with care. I drove it to the house, left the keys on the kitchen counter while no one was home, and walked to the bus stop. I packed what fit in a single bag. My laptop, which was mine, which I had bought with money I had earned. My notebooks, 3 years of them, filled with product architecture and market research and financial projections, and the kind of thinking on paper that I had never shown anyone because I had understood, from an early age, that in my family showing the inside of your thinking was a form of exposure that could be used against you. Some clothes, around $300 in cash I had saved from part-time work during school. I moved into a room rented from the older sister of a friend, $32 a week, a twin mattress, a single window that faced the brick wall of the adjacent building. When I sat on the bed and looked at the window, what I saw was brick. What I did not know in those first days was that Derek had been moving faster than the fallout from the dinner. He had spent the week between the dinner and my departure not simply observing the situation, but actively shaping it, which was how Derek always operated. Not in the open, not confrontationally, but laterally, in the private conversations where no one was watching, and where his particular talent for reading what each person most needed to hear could be deployed without an audience to complicate it. He had sat with my father separately and with my mother separately, and had made, in each conversation, the case that was best calibrated for each listener. With my father, he had made a structural argument. The company needed clarity of leadership, and clarity meant designating a successor before the question became a source of instability. With my mother, he had made an emotional one. She deserved peace, and peace required resolution, and resolution meant formalizing what everyone already knew, that Derek was the one who had been there, who was committed, who had chosen the family. The documents transferring full ownership of Colin's logistics to Derek were signed before the end of the month. My father called to inform me of this. He framed it as a business decision that had been made for the long-term health of the company, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone who has convinced himself that the framing is honest. I listened to everything he said. I thanked him for calling. I hung up and sat on the mattress in the room with the brick wall window and looked at nothing for a long time. I'm going to try to describe accurately what I felt in the days after that phone call, because I think accuracy matters here, and because the temptation in telling a story like this is to sand down the parts that are complicated and present a cleaner emotional arc than what was actually there. What I felt was not a single thing. There was grief in it, genuine physical grief, the kind that sits in your chest at an angle and makes normal breathing feel slightly effortful, the kind that is not about the specific things that were lost, but about the recognition of what those things lost means, which was, these people had always been willing to do this. The condition of their love had always included the possibility of this. I had simply not known that until now, and now I knew it. And there was no version of the knowledge that was not painful. There was also something else, something that arrived more slowly beneath the grief, colder and more structural, that I did not have a name for yet, but that I recognized as a fundamental shift in how I understood the world and my position in it. Something had been removed, not just from my life in the material sense, the car, the card, the access, the formal severance from the business, but from my internal architecture, a layer of naivety that I had not known was there, because naivety is invisible until it's stripped away, and then you see the shape of it clearly in the space it occupied. I had believed, in some unexamined pre-rational part of my thinking, that the people who were supposed to love me would respond to evidence, that if I showed something real, presented it clearly, made the case with care, the response would be commensurate with the quality of the presentation. I had believed in the meritocracy of my own family, which is perhaps the most specific form of naivety there is. Lauren was still with me. She came to the room with the brick wall window the evening after the call and sat with me for 3 hours. She did not fill the silence with reassurances. She sat in it with me, which is a different and more difficult thing, and which she could do because she was constitutionally honest about the difference between what you can fix and what you can only witness. She looked at the room without comment, the bare mattress, the single lamp, the bag against the wall, and did not perform dismay or sympathy, just looked at it and then looked at me. She asked what I needed. I said time. She said okay. She believed in the project. She continued to believe in it. She asked me questions about the timeline, about the money, about the customer interest, the real questions, about customer acquisition costs and competitive landscape, and what the failure scenario looked like if the first 2 interested operators decided not to sign. She told me she thought I was underestimating the time it would take to close the first contracts. She told me I needed to think about my operational burn rate more carefully. She told me that what I had was real and that she was not going anywhere. That lasted until the rumors started. I cannot tell you exactly when Derek began circulating them. because the particular kind of social damage he was constructing did not require him to be visible in it. It only required that the right things be said in the right conversations by people who were close enough to his world and to Lauren's world that the information would travel naturally through the ordinary channels of social proximity without any fingerprints on it. What I know is the shape of what people began telling me, some out of genuine concern, some out of the particular social compulsion that makes certain people unable to resist delivering bad news. And from those reports I was able to reconstruct the narrative that was being built. The story going around was that I had borrowed money, specific amounts from specific categories of people. It changed slightly in each version, which is how you know a rumor is organic to the network rather than arriving from a single source. In one version, I had borrowed from family members. In another, from business contacts. In a third, I had accumulated debt from failed business activities and was struggling to service it. None of it was true. Not one detail was supported by anything real. But financial instability rumors operate on a mechanism that has nothing to do with their truth value. They create pressure in the people who care about you, a low-level ambient stress around your name that is almost impossible to address directly, because addressing it directly requires constantly defending yourself against accusations that shift shape every time you try to pin them down. And the people who love you, even the ones who don't believe the rumors for a second, feel the weight of that pressure accumulating. Lauren didn't believe the rumors. She told me this directly, with the characteristic clarity she brought to everything she said to me. But she began to feel the questions from her friends. The way her mother spoke, carefully, around the subject of our relationship, not saying anything directly, nothing that could be called interference, just a particular quality of careful navigation that communicated everything without stating it. The accumulated small weight of being the person who was with the person everyone was talking about, even when the talking was wrong. Meanwhile, I was working. Not the way people use that word to mean they were busy or occupied or generally engaged. Working the way you work when you have nothing else, when there is no social life, no financial cushion, no structure of any kind, except the one you are building 1 hour at a time. I was in the rented room until midnight, in the library at 7 a.m, in the back corner of a coffee shop that tolerated long occupancy as long as you bought something every 2 hours. I had refined the product. I had made contact with a third potential customer. I had begun having conversations with a small group of regional investors, not venture capital, not institutional money, just local business people with some capital looking for early-stage opportunities, about a seed round that would let me hire one engineer and stop doing everything alone. The most serious of those conversations was with Patrick Simmons, not my father's Patrick Simmons. Different man, same name, which is one of those coincidences that life occasionally produces without any interest in how it will read later. This Patrick Simmons was a private investor who had inherited a small real estate portfolio and had been making quiet angel investments in regional businesses for approximately a decade. He was the kind of investor I needed precisely because he was not glamorous. He was thorough, he was local, he understood the specific economic landscape I was operating in, and he had the patience that comes from having made enough small investments over enough years to know that good things take longer than the timeline you put in the pitch deck. We had 4 meetings, each one longer than the last, each one going deeper into the product mechanics, the market sizing, the customer acquisition model, the competitive dynamics. His questions were excellent, the kind of questions that tell you someone has actually engaged with the material rather than pattern matching it against things they've seen before. By the 4th meeting, he was talking about terms, a number that would have covered 12 months of operations, given me the room to hire one engineer, and let me convert the existing customer interest into signed contracts. It was not a large check by any absolute standard. It was everything. Then he went quiet, A week of no response, then a message, through a mutual contact who had made the introduction, that was brief and final. Patrick Simmons had decided to pass on the opportunity, and he wished me well with the project. I spent 3 weeks trying to understand what had changed. The information eventually reached me through the kind of social proximity that makes certain things travel without anyone intending them to. A person who knew someone in Patrick Simmons' network, who had been at a dinner where something was mentioned, who passed it along because they thought I should know. What I learned was this: Derek had requested a meeting with Patrick Simmons. Derek had sat across from him and spoken about me in the register of a concerned older brother. Not accusatory, not hostile, nothing that could be called an attack. The language of worry, the language of someone who loves his younger brother and has seen, up close, the evidence that suggests caution is warranted. Derek had described me as impulsive, as someone with a pattern of overcommitting and under-delivering, as someone who had created significant friction within the family business and had been separated from it as a result of his own conduct. He had used the phrase, unstable dreamer, which I noticed was an evolution of the line from the dinner table, sharpened into something more technically useful when being deployed against a business investment rather than a family audience. Patrick Simmons was a careful man. Careful men do not ignore warnings from people who present themselves as having inside knowledge. He had passed. I sat with that information for a long time, not because it surprised me exactly. Derek's capacity for lateral invisible damage was something I had witnessed in small ways for years, and what he had done to the investor conversation was simply a larger application of the same skill. But sitting with it and understanding it fully were two different things, and what I needed to do before I could do anything useful with the anger was understand it fully. I needed to understand not just what Derek had done, but why it had worked. Why a single conversation with an older brother, conducted privately and framed as concern, could undo 4 meetings of careful, evidence-based relationship building with a serious investor. The answer was structural. I was visible. The project was in my name. The investor knew exactly who he was investing in and could be reached by anyone who wanted to put pressure on that knowledge. I had built something that could be found and interfered with because I had built it in the open, which meant I had built it vulnerable, which was the most important lesson I had learned so far. Even though the cost of learning it had been the one opportunity that might have changed my trajectory at the moment I most needed it changed, I rebuilt. I took every job I could find: delivery driving, warehouse loading, data entry contracts for small businesses that needed administrative support but couldn't afford a full-time hire. I worked those jobs without resentment, which I want to emphasize because resentment is corrosive in a specific way. It consumes the very attention that should be going toward what comes next, and I could not afford to waste attention. I did each job with my whole focus, and when I was not doing those jobs, I was reading, not textbooks, not the kind of material that generates credentials, but the operational reality of financial structures, of corporate architecture, of the gap between how businesses appeared to be owned and how they actually were. I had begun to understand that gap in an abstract way during the period of the investor conversations, but now I needed to understand it technically, mechanically, in the way that would let me use it. The second collapse arrived about 8 months after the investor failure, in the form of a business partnership that I had believed was secured, but that turned out to be secured only in the way that handshake agreements with people who have not aligned their incentives with yours are secured, which is to say, not at all. I had launched a consulting operation, essentially a manual version of what the software would eventually automate, a way to generate cash flow while the product development continued. It was unglamorous work, coordination and logistics optimization done by hand for small manufacturers, but it was real, and it was generating money, and it had the potential to build the client base I needed to prove the value of the automated product. I brought in a partner, Cameron Ellis, who had relationships with several regional manufacturers that I didn't have access to. Cameron was not dishonest in any way that he would have recognized as dishonest. He was the kind of person who makes decisions based on what is most immediately advantageous and is genuinely surprised when people characterize this as betrayal, because in his own understanding he was simply responding to the best available option at any given moment, which is what rational people do, and the fact that his doing so repeatedly disadvantaged the people who had trusted him was, in his framework, their problem for having trusted him insufficiently. He spent 8 months helping build the client base. Then he received an offer from a competitor, a small firm that had watched our growth with interest and wanted his relationships more than they wanted to compete with us. That included an equity stake, and he left. When he left, he took 3 clients. They were not his clients to take. He had not signed a non-compete because I had not had the legal sophistication at that point to insist on one, which was a mistake I have not made since, and which cost me, in that moment, both the revenue from those 3 clients and the debt I had accumulated building the infrastructure to service them. The debt was not catastrophic in an absolute sense. In a relative sense, relative to the resources I had, which were minimal, and relative to the momentum I had been building, which was now gone, it was devastating. It took me 3 months of working every available hour at every available job to pay it off. 3 months during which the product development stopped. 3 months during which the customer conversation stalled. 3 months during which Lauren watched me work 80 hours a week and come home too exhausted to speak and face the same uncertainty the following morning. She was 22 by then, finishing her degree. She had her own trajectory, her own professional development, her own plans, her own life that had its own demands and deserved its own attention, and the life adjacent to mine had become, by that point, something that required all of its energy simply to sustain, not because she had stopped believing in me. I want to be precise about this because it matters. She had not stopped believing, she told me this, but belief alone does not eliminate the physical and emotional cost of sustained uncertainty, of constant recalibration, of watching someone you love fight without being able to fight alongside them in any way that makes a material difference. She was 22 years old. She could not spend her 22nd year as a bystander to someone else's war. She told me this in a diner. She held my hands across the table while she said it. Not as a gesture, but because she was the kind of person who understood that certain conversations needed physical contact to be honest. She cried, not dramatically, not for long, just the real kind of crying, the kind that comes from genuinely caring about someone you have made the decision not to stay with. She said she was sorry in a way that meant something rather than nothing. I told her I understood. I told her I meant it. She nodded. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said that she hoped I would build what I was trying to build, and that she believed I could, and that she was sorry she wasn't going to be there to see it. She left. I paid the check. I sat in the diner for 20 minutes after she walked out, looking at the table where our coffee cups were still sitting, and then I walked back to the apartment I had moved into with 2 roommates, when I could finally afford to leave the room with the brick wall window. I sat on the edge of my bed. I did not think about the project. I did not think about next steps. I thought about the hand on my knee at the dinner table, brief and then gone, and about the same hands holding mine across the diner table, and about the particular cost of building something in the way that I was building it, which was the cost of everyone who got close enough to feel the full weight of what it required. I was 20 years old. I had significant debt that I had just finished paying. I had a product that existed but had no customers. I had a family that had disowned me. I had no partner. The world my father had described, the world of recognizable paths and predictable outcomes and credential-validated respectability, had been closed to me, and the alternative I was building had not yet materialized into anything that could be shown to another person and recognized as something. This is the section of the story I am going to spend the most time on, because it is the most important and because it is the section that people most want to abbreviate. The long part, the unclear part, the part where there is no visible progress and no visible plan, and where everything you are doing looks, from the outside and sometimes from the inside as well, like it might be nothing. People want to skip from the moment of collapse to the moment of rebuilding, because the thing in between, the staying, the continuing, the showing up to something that has not yet shown anything back to you, is not narratively satisfying. It does not have a shape. It does not produce visible results. It simply is what it is. The duration that has to be endured between the decision to build something and the first moment when what you are building begins to be visible. It took me 3 months to clear the debt from the consulting operation collapse. 3 months of delivery driving and warehouse loading and freelance administrative work, 18-hour days, living on the cheapest food I could find, spending nothing that wasn't necessary, which was everything except rent and food and the electricity that kept my laptop running. During those 3 months, I was not building anything, in the technical sense of adding new elements to what I was working toward. I was surviving the period that existed between what I had been and what I was going to become, and the only productive thing I did during it was to understand, more completely than I had before, what the failures had actually told me. The first startup had nearly worked and had been dismantled from the outside by someone who had access to the people I was depending on and who understood that the most efficient way to destroy something is to reach the people who are about to give it the resources it needs to survive. The second project had partially worked and had been dismantled from the inside by someone whose interests had never been fully aligned with mine and whom I had trusted on the basis of the social proximity between us, rather than any verified evidence of actual alignment. Both of those failures were, when I looked at them with the honesty that the distance of 3 months of grueling work allowed, not accidents. They were the predictable results of building something visible, building it with my name on it, and building it in partnership with people whose incentives I had not secured. The lesson was not complicated. It was brutal, but it was not complicated. Everything I built from this point forward had to be invisible, not in any illegal sense, not in any sense that violated the structures of legitimate commerce, but invisible in the operational meaning of the word, not findable by people who wanted to find it, not attributable in any direct sense to me, not vulnerable to the kind of lateral interference that had destroyed the first project, not dependent on partners who had not had their interests secured through structures that made alignment more advantageous than defection. I needed to learn how to build things that did not have my name on them, and I needed to learn from someone who understood how that was actually done. The person I found was Leonard Jacobs. Leonard was 71 years old when I first met him. He had spent 30 years as a corporate attorney before retiring, and he occupied his retirement with a combination of reading, occasional consulting for former clients who he found interesting, and periodic meetings with young people who had been referred to him by people whose judgment he respected. He had been referred to me, or more precisely I had been referred to him, by a man I had met during the warehouse loading work, an older engineer named Aaron Grant, who had noticed me reading corporate legal filings on my phone during lunch breaks, with an attention he found unusual enough to remark upon. Aaron Grant had asked me why I was reading those documents. I told him. He made a phone call. Leonard Jacobs operated out of a home office in a quiet part of the city, in a house that was modestly furnished in the way of people who have always had enough money to be completely indifferent to the performance of it. He met with me for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon, and spent the first 45 minutes asking me questions that were progressively more technical and harder to answer without revealing the precise location of the holes in my understanding. He was not warm in the conventional sense. He was precise in the way that people who have spent their professional lives distinguishing between what things actually mean and what people want them to mean tend to be, which is a different quality from warmth, but which has its own usefulness. He found my situation interesting, not admirable, not sympathetic, interesting. He said that the pattern of what had happened to me was a pattern he had seen before in various forms, and that the most common mistake people in my position made was to fight the next battle using the strategies that had failed in the previous one. He agreed to meet with me regularly, every 2 weeks, for 8 months. The meetings were not mentoring sessions in the warm and encouraging sense. They were interrogations of my understanding, and my understanding was wrong more often than it was right, and he corrected it with the patience of someone who has made his peace with the fact that useful knowledge is slow to accumulate and cannot be rushed without becoming distorted. He taught me about financial structures, about the legal architecture of holding companies and investment vehicles and the gap between nominal ownership and actual control. He taught me about the difference between the entity that holds an asset and the entity that controls how that asset is used, and how those can be structured to be two completely different things, connected through chains of documentation so ordinary and bureaucratically unremarkable that no one who encounters them in the normal course of business has any reason to look beyond the surface. The most important thing he taught me was this: the structures that actually work are boring, not clever in the way that attracts attention, not innovative in the way that creates press interest, not sophisticated in a way that signals sophistication to anyone looking at them. Boring. The visual grammar of competent mid-tier administrative infrastructure, holdings companies with names that sound like they were generated by someone choosing words from a regional geography textbook, registered addresses in ordinary business parks, standard documentation using language that was current and proper, and gave no indication of anything beyond its stated purpose. He said, the goal is for someone to look at the structure and feel, immediately and without needing to think about it, that there is nothing here that warrants further attention. That feeling is the product of boringness. Boringness is engineered. It requires more care and sophistication than the things that attract attention, and receives no credit for the care it took, which is why most people who need it are not willing to do it properly. I spent the months after those meetings doing 2 things simultaneously: continuing to pay off the last of my debts through hourly work, and designing the architecture Leonard had been describing. Not implementing it yet. I didn't have the resources to implement it yet, but designing it. On paper, in my notebooks, in the careful theoretical form of something that will one day be real. I designed the holding structure, the investment vehicle, the layers between the thing and my name. I thought about what the first actual asset would need to be, what the second would be, what the relationship between them would need to look like for the overall structure to generate the kind of leverage I was ultimately working toward. I designed it the way you design something you are going to need to live inside of for a decade, accounting for every failure point, every place where something could go wrong, and expose more of the underlying structure than was safe to expose. I also, during this period, resumed work on the software product, not in the way I had worked on it before, not with my name attached, not through any entity that linked back to me, but through a newly formed LLC with a name so generic it could have belonged to any of 50 regional technology consultancies. The product was the same product I had been building for 3 years. The entity presenting it to the world was something else entirely. I signed the first paying customer, a small freight operator 3 states away, someone I had never met in person, someone who had found the product through a directory listing and evaluated it purely on its merits. Through that entity, under terms that had nothing to do with anything in my name. The check cleared. The revenue was real. It was the first real revenue I had generated from the thing I had been trying to build for 3 years, and I sat with the confirmation email for a long time before allowing myself to feel anything about it. I was 22 years old when that first check cleared. I will remember the amount for the rest of my life. $840. Monthly subscription. A single small logistics operator in a state I had never been to, paying $840 a month for software that I had built in a rented room over 3 years. $840 was not a transformation of my circumstances. It was a proof of concept. It was evidence that the thing was real, that people who had no reason to be kind to me, who had never met me, who had no social relationship with me of any kind, would pay money for the thing I had made because the thing I had made solved a problem they actually had. I added a second customer 7 weeks later, a third 2 months after that. By the time I was 23, I had 5 paying customers and enough monthly recurring revenue to stop doing warehouse work and focus entirely on the product. I moved into a small apartment by myself, not large, not particularly comfortable, but mine, without roommates, without the particular social tax of shared living. I furnished it minimally. I did not buy anything that wasn't necessary. I worked. The architecture I had designed during the Leonard Jacobs period began to take real form when I was 24. The product revenue, modest as it was generating a surplus above my operating costs. That surplus went into the holding structure, the first vehicle, the simplest layer, the foundation that everything else would eventually sit on. I had 8 software customers by then, and the recurring revenue was predictable enough that a small number of regional investors, introduced through careful, relationship-based communication, never through anything public, never through anything that generated documentation with my name prominently attached, were willing to put capital into the structure. Not large amounts, not institutional investment, the kind of quiet, boring deployment of capital that leaves no trail because it has no reason to leave one. Leonard helped me structure the investment vehicle correctly. His real estate attorney colleague, a man named Ian Collins, different Collins, no relation to my family, which was a coincidence I noted without sentiment, helped me with the documentation on the first real estate acquisitions. The acquisitions were small at first, unremarkable parcels and small commercial properties in the regional market that had no apparent connection to anything except the entities holding them, which had no apparent connection to me. I was building furniture. That was how I thought of it. Building furniture. The ordinary, necessary, unglamorous infrastructure of a real estate and investment operation, the kind that no one writes about because there is nothing to write about, because it generates no news and no drama, and nothing except the quiet, compounding arithmetic of assets held and liabilities managed. I want to talk about Derek during this period, because his trajectory was the backdrop against which I was building mine, and the contrast mattered to me psychologically in ways that I have been honest about with myself, even when being honest about it was uncomfortable. After the transfer of ownership, Derek had expanded Collins Logistics with a competence I was not entirely prepared to acknowledge. He was not simply coasting on what my father had built. He restructured the company's debt load in his first year, a move that showed more financial sophistication than I would have credited him with, and which I noted carefully in my understanding of him. He secured 3 new municipal contracts through a combination of political relationship building and competitive pricing that he could sustain because the restructuring had given him room. He hired well, which surprised me when I heard it secondhand, because Derek had always struck me as the kind of person who needed to be the dominant intelligence in every room, and dominant intelligences do not always hire people who might challenge that dominance. But he seemed to have understood, at some level, that surrounding yourself with capable people and making them feel recognized was its own form of leverage, which was true, and which I had to respect even as I was watching him do it. He appeared in local business magazines, not the prominent, widely read ones, regional publications, the kind that serve the audience of small business owners and civic professionals who read this kind of media as a form of professional participation rather than genuine information seeking. He was photographed at charitable events in the careful, low-key way of a businessman cultivating a specific civic identity. He gave talks at the Chamber of Commerce. He was described in one profile I read 3 times with a particular attention as the responsible son who chose the right path while his younger brother walked away from a family legacy. The profile did not name me. It did not need to. The contrast was structural, built into the framing, present in every sentence, even when absent from the explicit content. My father gave an interview to a regional business publication about the importance of discipline and the value of choosing practicality over fantasy. He did not mention me. My mother sent birthday cards every year with small notes that were warm in the careful, contracted way of someone who is trying to maintain a connection that she does not know how to discuss directly. I kept the cards. I did not respond to most of them, not because I was punishing her, I was not, but because the response she would have found most useful was one I was not ready to write, and I had learned enough about the cost of saying things before you were ready to say them that I was willing to wait until readiness arrived. I want to be honest about the years between 22 and 28, about what they actually look like from the inside, rather than what they look like in retrospect. The retrospective version has a shape, quiet accumulation, patient architecture, the methodical assembly of something that would eventually be overwhelming. The inside version was different. The inside version included many nights of genuine uncertainty about whether what I was doing had any correspondence to what was actually possible, or whether the architecture I was constructing was an elaborate, self-sustaining fantasy, the kind that certain driven people build around themselves in the aftermath of failure, because the fantasy of future power is more bearable than the reality of present powerlessness. There were periods when the software product stalled, when a customer churned, when a technical problem proved harder to solve than expected, when the product market fit felt less clear than it had the week before. There were periods when the investment structure felt like an idea rather than a reality, when the numbers on paper were not yet producing anything that could be seen or touched. There were periods when I watched Derek's company continue to grow, and his name continue to appear in print, and the family's public narrative continue to unfold without me, and when I felt the particular loneliness of someone who is operating entirely in the invisible world while the visible world moves on without them. I did not indulge those feelings for long, not because I had achieved some state of equanimity that was superior to ordinary human response, but because I had come to understand that the feelings were information rather than direction. The information they carried was, this is hard, and it is taking longer than you hoped, and there is no one outside of yourself who is going to validate the work you are doing right now, which means that the only fuel available is internal, and internal fuel is finite, and must be managed carefully, or it will be gone before the thing is finished. I managed it. I slept enough. I ate real food. I exercised in the mornings in the limited way available to someone with no gym membership, running mostly in the early hours before the streets filled up, when the city had the quality of belonging to whoever was awake in it. I read widely outside the domains that were immediately relevant to what I was building, because reading widely was the thing that kept my thinking from calcifying into the narrow channels that relentless focus tends to produce. I also, during this period, studied the object of what I was ultimately building toward, which was not something I had articulated clearly to myself in the early years, but which had clarified, over time, into something specific and real. Derek's company was structurally vulnerable in ways that he did not know I knew. I knew them because I'd spent enough years in proximity to the family business to understand its fundamental architecture, the client concentration, the geographic dependency, the debt structure, the municipal contract dependency that was both its greatest source of revenue stability and its greatest single point of failure. I knew that the infrastructure model it was built on, human labor-intensive warehouse coordination, regional freight management using a fleet that had not been modernized in 6 years, was facing competitive pressure from automation that was already available at the enterprise level, and that would reach the mid-market within a decade. I knew that the expansion Derek was planning would require capital that would need to come from somewhere, and that the places he was most likely to go for that capital had their own structural vulnerabilities. The first move I made toward Derek's company was indirect and took 2 years to become operational. I had been watching the warehouse automation sector since the early days of my software product, because the logistics industry was the domain I understood most deeply, and because I could see clearly, by the time I was 25, that the labor model underlying most regional logistics operations was going to face systematic disruption within a decade. The question was not whether automation would happen, it was who would build the tools that mid-market operators would actually adopt, given that the enterprise-level solutions were too expensive and too complex for companies the size of Collins Logistics and its peers. I identified, over 18 months of careful attention, a team, 2 engineers and a product designer, all working at a larger firm in the sector and all clearly frustrated by the pace at which their employer was moving. They were building, informally and on their own time, an early version of exactly what I thought the market needed. I had several conversations with each of them, carefully, without revealing my ultimate interest in what they were doing. I made a determination that they were technically excellent and that they could execute. I co-financed their departure and the formation of their company through a fund vehicle that had no visible connection to me. The term sheet they received was from an entity that was, to them, a quiet regional small business investment fund with a standard structure and a clean track record. They negotiated the terms in good faith. They launched their company, they built the product they had been building, informally, now with real resources and real runway, and within 18 months they had their first paying client. Within 2 years, they had a dozen. Their pricing was specifically designed for the mid-market regional logistics sector, lower than enterprise alternatives, more adaptable to the operational realities of companies in the size range of Collins Logistics and its competitors. Within 3 years of their launch, they were the most efficient automation solution available to exactly the type of operator that my brother's company was competing against, and that my brother's company was competing to become. Derek's company began feeling the competitive pressure of this when I was 27. Not catastrophically at first. The automation displacement of regional logistics companies is not an overnight phenomenon. It is a slow and relentless grinding, like tidal erosion. But in the monthly revenue numbers, in the customer retention rates, in the pricing concessions, Derek's team was having to make to hold clients who were now receiving credible pitches from operators who had adopted the automation tools. The pressure was visible if you knew where to look. Derek knew where to look. He responded by announcing a significant expansion. If the company grew fast enough and large enough, the automation pressure would be a competitive challenge it could absorb rather than a threat to its survival. Expansion planning began. Site identification began. Capital was assembled. This is where the land became relevant. For 2 years prior to the expansion announcement, I had been acquiring, through a series of holding structures that Ian Collins and Leonard Jacobs had helped design, the land surrounding the sites that Collins Logistics' expansion planning team had identified as the locations for the new facilities. This was not secret in any illegal sense. Land purchases are public records, filed, indexed, available to anyone who cares to search them. What made the acquisition invisible was the structure through which it was done. The entities holding the land were registered under names that were locally generic, referenced no recognizable person or brand, and had no searchable connection to anything in my name or to any entity that had any connection to me. Derek's expansion planning team had run searches on the available land. They had found available land. They had not found that the land surrounding their target sites had, over the preceding 2 years, been systematically acquired by entities they had no reason to investigate. When the expansion planning reached the stage of securing the actual sites, the land around the target locations was not available at the prices the expansion budget had anticipated. The entities that held it were not interested in selling at market rate. They were willing to negotiate, but the negotiations moved slowly, and the prices being discussed were substantially above budget. Derek's team searched for alternative sites. There were fewer viable alternatives than their planning had assumed, partly because the regional real estate market had tightened, and partly because the particular combination of zoning, infrastructure access, and proximity to the client base that made a site suitable for their purposes was less commonly available than a general search suggested. The expansion slowed. The timeline extended from its planned duration by months, then by more months. The cost projections ballooned. Meanwhile, I had been working on the banking relationship for a year and a half. The primary lender for Collins Logistics was a regional bank, mid-size, community-focused, the kind of institution that builds its business model on relationships with exactly the type of regional businesses my brother's company represented. Banks like this had been under continuous pressure from the economic conditions of the preceding several years. Tightening margins, regulatory requirements that consumed capital that would otherwise have been deployed, competitive pressure from larger institutions, and from fintech alternatives that were systematically capturing the portions of their customer base that were most profitable. The bank was not in distress, but it was not comfortable, and in times of discomfort, well-managed institutions look more carefully at their existing portfolio than they do in times of ease. I acquired a minority stake in the bank through an investment vehicle that listed me as one of a dozen passive investors, none of them prominent, all of them with legitimate reasons for making the investment. Minority stakes in community banks are not the subject of scrutiny. They are the subject of paperwork. The paperwork was filed correctly and completely and gave no indication of anything except a passive investment by a regional fund with a clean compliance record. I was one name among many on a document that I was confident no one in my brother's world would ever read. But a minority stake, even a small one, gives you something that is more valuable than ownership in many circumstances. It gives you relationships within the institution. It gives you legitimate reasons to attend meetings, to have conversations with senior staff, to understand the lending portfolio at a level of detail that a passive investor in a public company would not have access to. I developed, with patience and without urgency, a relationship with a senior lending officer at the bank, a man I'll call Henry Porter, who was experienced and careful, and who knew me as a quietly engaged minority investor with a background in regional business investment. When the macroeconomic conditions began deteriorating, and I had been watching the indicators carefully enough to have a reasonable expectation of the timing, I was in a position to have conversations, through entirely appropriate channels, about the health of the lending portfolio in the context of the changing environment. Conversations that raised, professionally and with full documentary support, the question of whether certain credits in the portfolio needed to be reassessed, given the performance against their original underwriting assumptions. Commercial loan covenants are standard. Every business loan of any size has them. Agreed metrics that the borrower is expected to maintain, covering things like revenue levels, coverage ratios, asset values, project completion timelines. When those metrics are not met, the covenants trigger remedies that the bank has the right to exercise: increases in the interest rate, demands for additional collateral, in extreme cases, acceleration of the debt, requiring the full amount to be repaid immediately rather than on the original schedule. The covenants in Derek's loan structure had been written during a period of expansion optimism, when the projections had been generous and the bank had been willing to accept the associated risk. The economics environment had shifted. The projections were not being met. The expansion was delayed and over budget. The municipal contract revenue, which was a significant component of the cash flow that serviced the debt, was about to become uncertain for reasons I'll describe in a moment. The loan covenants triggered. The bank exercised its right to reassess. The terms of the credit facility were adjusted in ways that increased Collins Logistics' cost of capital at precisely the moment when it needed cheap capital most. The municipal contract situation developed from the audit. Henry Grant, the accountant who had worked for Collins Logistics for a decade before Derek replaced him with a firm less likely to ask difficult questions, had not, when he left the company, left his knowledge of its financial history behind him. He had the detailed working knowledge of someone who has spent 10 years understanding not just the numbers but the decisions behind the numbers, and some of those decisions in the years when the company had been building its municipal contract relationships had involved financial reporting that was not precisely inaccurate in any single way, but that, taken as a pattern, reflected a set of practices that would be difficult to defend under careful scrutiny. Henry Grant had not done anything with this knowledge after leaving, because Henry Grant was not a vengeful person. He was a meticulous one. He had started his own practice, an independent audit firm, modest in its initial scale, building its reputation through competent, thorough work, and he had built it with the capital from a regional small business investment fund that he had found through a referral from a contact in the regional business community. He did not know who was behind the fund. He did not need to know. The fund had done its diligence on his qualifications and his business plan, and had found them sound. Henry Grant's firm developed a reputation for thoroughness that is the natural outcome of consistently good work over time. This reputation eventually brought it to the attention of a municipal oversight body that was conducting a routine review of contractors who had received public funds. These reviews are standard. They happen to every significant municipal contractor on a rotating basis, and they are conducted by audit firms that are selected for their competence and their independence from the contractors being reviewed. Henry Grant's firm was selected for the review that covered Collins Logistics. The review identified discrepancies, not fraud, not in any formal legal sense, not yet, not at the stage of findings I'm describing, but discrepancies significant enough to require formal response, significant enough to trigger a pause in the municipal contracts pending the completion of the compliance process. The pause was announced through official channels. It was handled procedurally and correctly by all parties. It simply meant that a major source of Collins Logistics cash flow, the revenue stream that serviced a significant portion of its debt obligations, was now uncertain for a duration that no one could predict. 4 things were now happening simultaneously. The automation pressure bleeding revenue from the competitive landscape. The land problem stalling the expansion and consuming planning budget without producing expansion capacity. The loan covenant triggers increasing the cost of capital and restricting operational flexibility. The municipal contract pause removing a critical component of cash flow. None of these things, individually, would have been sufficient to create the kind of pressure I needed. All 4 of them together, arriving within a compressed time window, created a situation that had no clean solution from the inside. Derek's options were the options available to a business facing simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts without the liquidity to address any of them adequately. He could seek additional capital, but additional capital was not easily available to a business in his position. He could attempt to negotiate with the bank, but the bank's position had been influenced by factors he couldn't fully see. He could look for strategic partners or buyers, but any serious buyer would do the due diligence that would reveal the municipal accounting questions. He could attempt to resolve the land problem, but the entities he was negotiating with were not motivated to move quickly. He scrambled. Derek Collins, who had spent 8 years being the local business magazine version of competent and responsible, scrambled. He called suppliers and asked for extended terms and got some, but not enough. He approached alternative lenders and got expensive offers that would have solved the liquidity problem by making it larger. He tried to accelerate the municipal compliance process and found that it moved on its own schedule regardless of his urgency. He reached out to potential buyers who did initial diligence and found reasons not to proceed. My parents called me at this point. I had not spoken to my father in 6 years. I had had occasional brief contact with my mother. She called sometimes, just to know the connection was still there, without ever addressing what had happened. And I had received those calls with the careful restraint that I had learned was the only honest way to handle them. When my father called, his voice was older than the voice I had been carrying in my memory, and it carried something his voice had never carried when I was living under his roof, genuine uncertainty. He said he didn't understand what was happening to the company. He said Derek was under enormous pressure that seemed to be coming from directions neither of them could fully identify. He said, and this was the most significant thing, the thing that told me how far his understanding of the situation had drifted from ordinary reality. He said he suspected there were people involved with interests he didn't understand, people who might be operating at a level he wasn't seeing. He asked me if I had any idea who might have a reason to move against the company. I told him I didn't know. He said he hoped I hadn't gotten mixed up with dangerous people. He said this not with threat or accusation, but with the confused vulnerability of someone who has spent his life being certain and has found the certainties suddenly unreliable. He was not apologizing. He did not reference the dinner, or the week after it, or the 6 years between. He was asking for help from the son he had called a disgrace in front of 12 people, in the register of someone who did not yet understand that those two things were related. I told him I would see what I could find out. My voice was completely even. I thanked him for calling. I set the meeting for 3 weeks after that phone call. I chose the location, a glass-walled conference room in a downtown commercial building that I had been using for meetings related to several of the investment entities I controlled. Neutral territory in the sense that it carried no recognizable affiliation with anything in my name or Derek's. Professional in the way that told you, immediately upon entering, that whatever was about to happen was a business meeting. I had the room prepared, printed materials, bound, organized in the way of a formal investment presentation, numbers, structure charts, timelines. Derek came with his financial advisor, Scott Keller, who had worked with the family company for years and who was a competent man who was about to find himself looking at something he had not seen before. I came alone. When Derek walked into the room and saw me, his face ran through several things in rapid sequence. Surprise was the first, and it was genuine, which told me that his intelligence had not yet connected the dots in any complete way. Recalibration was the second, the specific expression of someone who is rapidly updating a model they have been operating with. He sat down. He looked at me across the table for a moment, in the way that people look at someone when they are trying to decide what version of the interaction they are in. Then he looked at the bound documents in front of the chairs across from his. I began with the numbers. I walked through them in the sequence I had organized them, the current loan position, the covenant triggers and their specific activation conditions, the timeline to default if current conditions persisted without intervention, the land situation, the entities that held the surrounding parcels, the negotiating positions those entities had maintained, the cost implications for the expansion plan if the impasse continued, the municipal contract pause, and the financial documentation that had generated it, the competitive landscape in the automation sector, and the revenue projections under 2 scenarios, one where the company maintained its current operational model, one where operational restructuring was implemented. I was thorough. I did not rush. I spoke in the exact tone I used when presenting investment analysis to any investor, factual, precise, without emotional content. Scott Keller, Derek's financial advisor, was taking notes in the first 15 minutes. Then he stopped taking notes. He put down his pen. He looked at the structure charts I had placed on the table, the diagram showing the ownership chains of several of the entities I had been describing, and he looked at them with the expression of someone doing mathematics that is arriving at a result he did not expect. Derek did not say anything until I reached the structure chart. He looked at it for a long time. The chart was clear. It was designed to be clear, not to obscure, not at this point, because obscuring it would have been beside the point. He traced the ownership chain with his eyes, following the lines from these entities that held the land to the investment fund, that held positions in those entities, to the holding company that controlled the fund. He looked at it the way you look at something that you are trying to find an alternative interpretation of, and can't, because the structure is exactly what it appears to be. Then he looked at me. He said, "How long have you been building this?" I said, "A long time." He said more quietly, and the quietness was not just volume, it was a change in the quality of his attention. Something had become very focused in him. Some part of his understanding that had been loosely organized was snapping into alignment. "You built all of this?" I said, "Yes." The silence that followed lasted approximately 30 seconds. In the glass-walled conference room, with the sound of the building's ventilation system and the distant noise of the city outside, 30 seconds of silence has a significant presence. Scott Keller was completely still. Derek looked at the structure chart. Then he looked at me again, and what I saw in his face was not the thing I had expected to see. I had expected anger or denial, or the particular defensive confidence of someone who believes, even in a compromised position, that there is a maneuver available. What I saw instead was something more honest than any of those things: recognition. He was recognizing what he was looking at, and the recognition was complete, and there was nothing in it that suggested he intended to argue with the mathematics. He said, "What do you want?" I walked him through the terms. They were straightforward. The controlling stake in Collins Logistics, transferred to the investment group I controlled, at a valuation that reflected the company's current distressed position rather than the position it had been in before the pressure arrived. In exchange, the land entities would facilitate the expansion at cost, removing the primary obstacle to the growth Derek had planned. The loan situation would be addressed through the banking relationships I now had access to. The terms that had been adjusted could be adjusted again in the direction of relief rather than restriction when the ownership structure changed. The municipal compliance process, while independent and proceeding on its own schedule, would proceed in an environment where any new irregularities would not be actively identified, because the firm conducting the review would no longer be operating under conditions that brought it into contact with the historical accounting questions. Derek would be retained. This was not a concession, it was structural sense. He had relationships with every major client, with every significant supplier, with the municipal contacts that were the company's primary business development channel. Those relationships had value. A new ownership structure that destroyed those relationships in the process of acquiring the asset would be destroying a substantial portion of what made the asset worth acquiring. He would have a senior operational role, real authority within his domain, real compensation appropriate to his experience. He would not have the controlling stake. He would not have the seat at the head of the table. He would work, from this point forward, within an organizational structure that was ultimately controlled by the younger brother he had called a dreamer. Scott Keller said his client would need time to consult with counsel. I said, of course. The offer was open for 30 days. After 30 days, the default clauses in the loan structure would activate on their own schedule. The land negotiations would proceed at their current impasse without any facilitation from entities I controlled, and the municipal compliance process would continue on its independent timeline without any influence from my side. Derek looked at me for a long moment before they left the room. It was the longest sustained eye contact we had had since I was a child, and what was in it was not what I had imagined over years of constructing this moment in my mind during the quiet hours of the invisible years. There was no dramatic collapse in it, no visible humiliation, no moment of theatrical reckoning. There was simply a man who was intelligent enough to understand, fully and completely, what had been done and how it had been done, and who was sitting with that understanding without yet knowing what to do with it. He understood that the trap had not been built in the preceding months, in the period when the pressure had begun to arrive. He understood that it had been built in years, quietly, systematically, with a patience and a structural precision that he had never imagined I was capable of, because he had never extended to me the kind of respect that would have required him to imagine it. He had made a calculation at a dinner table when I was 18, and the calculation had been based on an assessment that was wrong, and the wrongness of the assessment had not mattered for 8 years, because nothing in those 8 years had revealed it, and now something had. He signed the documents 18 days later. His attorneys negotiated modifications to several terms. The operational scope of his retained role was defined more broadly than I had initially specified. The transition timeline was extended. The valuation had a modest upward adjustment. I accepted all of it, because none of it changed the substantive outcome. The controlling stake transferred. Collins Logistics moved into the structure I controlled. My brother now worked for an entity that was ultimately owned by me. I called my mother that evening. I told her, briefly and without drama, what had occurred. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she didn't understand how this had happened, and I told her that was all right, and she said she was sorry, and I told her I believed her, and she began a sentence that she was unable to finish because she didn't know how to end it, and I waited, and then I said I would be in touch, and I said goodbye. My father has not called since the conversation before the meeting. I have made no effort to contact him. The particular accounting between us involves debts that are not of the kind that can be settled in a conference room, or discharged by the transfer of ownership documents. They are of the kind that live in the body, that alter the architecture of how a person moves through the world, that shape the quality of every relationship they form after the moment when the damage was done. I carry them. He carries them. We carry them separately and at a distance, and that is, for now and perhaps permanently, the only arrangement that is honest. The last thing I want to talk about before I tell you where things actually are is Lauren. I had tracked her trajectory during the 8 years in the way that you track someone who mattered to you, not through surveillance or obsession, but through the ordinary channels of social proximity and the information that moves naturally through shared networks. I knew she had finished her degree. I knew she had gone into supply chain consulting, which made complete sense given her aptitude and the way her mind worked. She had always understood operational problems with an intuitive precision that was rarer than most people recognized. I knew she had been promoted twice at the regional firm she had joined after graduating. I knew she had developed a genuine professional reputation, the kind that is built slowly and held together by consistent competence rather than by any particular charisma or political skill. I had thought about Lauren during those 8 years with the particular quality of thinking that is neither obsession nor indifference, the kind of sustained, honest attention you give to someone who shaped something important in you. She had not betrayed me. She had not made a coward's choice. She had made an honest choice under genuinely difficult conditions, and she had been honest about the choice, and I had been honest about understanding it. That honesty did not make it painless. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I had carried them simultaneously without needing them to resolve into something simpler. The role I offered her was real. I want to be absolutely clear about this. I had expanded the investment group to a scale that required operational leadership, not investment management, but the kind of sophisticated logistics and supply chain operations management that was the specific domain of competence Lauren had been building for a decade. The role existed because it needed to exist. It paid what it paid because that was what the market paid for that level of experience and that level of demonstrated skill. When I asked a retained search firm to identify candidates for the position, the parameters of the search produced a candidate pool from which her name emerged through entirely standard process. She was not the only strong candidate. She was, by the assessment of the search firm and by my own evaluation of the candidates presented, the strongest. When her name appeared in the candidate pool, I made a decision that I believed was the only honest one, to disclose, before she engaged further with the process, who was behind the company making the offer. I did this through the search firm, which communicated it in the appropriate professional manner. Lauren received this information and took a week before responding. When she responded, she asked for a direct call. We talked for an hour and a half. The first 30 minutes were about the role, the actual substance of it, the scope, the reporting structure, the compensation, the growth trajectory of the organization. She asked excellent questions. The quality of her questions told me she was genuinely interested, and that the interest was professional rather than personal, which was what I had hoped for. Then she stopped and said she needed to ask me something. I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Why me specifically?" And she said, "I don't mean professionally." I told her the truth. I said she was the strongest candidate by any professional measure, and that I had verified that before the search had produced her name. I said that when her name appeared, I made the decision to be transparent, rather than allow her to accept an offer from a company without knowing who was behind it, because she deserved to make an informed choice. I said I remembered the dinner. I said I remembered what she did and what she didn't do, and that it had stayed with me, not as a debt that needed settling, but as a fact about her character that I had never been able to forget, because accurate observations about people's character, made at moments of genuine pressure, are among the most reliable data points available, and I had been in the business of paying attention to accurate data points for a long time. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That was a long time ago." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you expecting something from this that isn't in the job description?" I told her no. I told her the offer was the offer, without hidden terms, and that if she wanted to work together, I believed we would do excellent work, and if she didn't, I would respect that without qualification. She said she needed to think about it. She took the role 3 weeks later. She has been outstanding at it. The things I'd believed about her capacity, the precision of her thinking, the honesty of her operational assessment, the particular quality of her judgment that combines technical rigor with an accurate read of human systems, have all proven to be exactly what I remembered, and have been applied to challenges that are considerably larger than anything either of us was working on when we were 20. We work together well. There is something between us that is not quite what it was, and not quite what it would be if the history between us did not exist, and we have both, without discussing it explicitly, found a way to occupy that space with honesty and without drama, which seems to me to be the most that can be reasonably asked. I am 30 years old. I want to end this the way it actually is, rather than the way it's supposed to be, because I have told you the truth about everything else, and I am not going to stop now at the ending, which is where the temptation to simplify is strongest. There is no triumphant feeling that I can describe to you. There is no moment of vindication that arrived clean, the way vindication arrives in the stories where it is the destination rather than a waypoint in an ongoing life. There was the morning after the documents were signed, which looked identical to the morning before the documents were signed, because the world does not pause and acknowledge the completion of a private project that most of the world did not know existed. There was coffee made in my kitchen. There was a meeting at 9. There was the ordinary continuation of things. I won. By any measure you could apply to the word, I won. The company that was taken from me before I ever held it is now controlled by an entity I own. The brother who called me a dreamer and then spent years systematically impeding the thing I was dreaming of now operates within a structure I built. the investor who was scared away from my first project by a private meeting in which I was described as an unstable dreamer, would have returned 17 times his investment if he had not been scared away. The business partner who took my clients and left me in debt is working for a company that is a customer of software I own. The structure is real, and it is mine, and it generates returns that are significant by any standard my father ever used to evaluate significance. And I am different from the person who sat at that dinner table at 18 years old and answered a question calmly while everything burned, not destroyed, not damaged beyond function, not hollowed out, not a cautionary tale about the cost of winning, but changed in a way that is complete and permanent, and that I have made my peace with, because the alternative to accepting the change is to pretend it didn't happen, and I have spent too many years in the business of seeing things clearly to pretend. I do not trust easily. I want to be precise about what that means. It does not mean I am incapable of genuine connection, or that I am cold, or that the people around me are interacting with someone who is performing warmth rather than experiencing it. It means that the part of me that evaluates people and situations, that assesses structural vulnerabilities and possible interference and the alignment of interests, that was developed over 8 years of invisible construction and does not turn off simply because the construction is complete. Lauren told me at a dinner 6 months after she joined the company that being around me sometimes felt like standing next to someone who was perpetually running calculations you couldn't see. She said it with affection. She said it with accuracy. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and I accepted them without needing them to be something simpler. I think about the dinner table. Not constantly, not with the obsessive quality that would indicate something unresolved. But sometimes, in the quiet moments that every life contains, I return to it with the attention that important things deserve. I think about the 18-year-old sitting at that table trying to say something real, in a room that had already decided what it thought. I think about what I would tell him if I could travel back to that moment, and I find that I would not tell him it was going to be all right, because I don't know that it was all right. It was something. It was what happened. It was the raw material out of which a particular life was made. I would not tell him the ending, because the ending is not the thing that would have been most useful to know. I would tell him to pay attention, that the room and the people in it, and the specific way each person chose to behave at a moment of genuine pressure was information, that the laughter was information, that the silence was information, that the weight of his father's voice using a particular word was information, that the particular quality of the hand on his knee, once brief, then gone, was the most important piece of information in the room, and that he should carry it very carefully, because people reveal their actual character at moments of difficulty, and what is revealed at those moments is more reliable than anything that is ever said in ordinary time. I would tell him, the people who didn't laugh are worth everything. Build around them. The rest is mathematics. Derek calls occasionally. Professional conversations about operational matters. Brief, civil in the way of people who have been in a serious conflict and have arrived at a mutual understanding that there is no version of litigating it that produces anything worth having. There is no warmth in it. There is also no hostility. There is something more adult than either, the acknowledgement between two people who understand what happened and have both emerged from it with a clearer picture of what the other is actually made of. He has never apologized. I have never required it. The apology would be for my benefit, and I have learned to identify carefully the things that are actually for my benefit and the things that merely perform the appearance of it. My parents are in their house. My father is retired. My mother tends her garden. I saw them once, at a family gathering I attended because my aunt asked me, and I decided that the cost of attending was less than the cost of the prolonged awkwardness of refusing. My father shook my hand at the door. He held it a moment longer than a handshake requires. He looked at me with an expression that was trying to communicate something that he did not know how to put into language, and probably never will. I did not help him. I shook his hand. I went inside. We did not discuss the company or the years or the dinner or anything that was real, and we did not need to, because everything real had already been communicated through channels that required no speech. The things I lost along the way were real. I don't want to minimize them in the rounding up that retrospect can produce. Lauren, the first time, the particular Lauren of those 2 years when I was building the first version of everything, and she was the only person in the world who knew what I was actually doing. The version of my life that would have existed if the dinner had gone differently, if my father had been a different man, if Derek had been a different person, if the investor had not been reached before he could make his decision. Those alternatives exist in some theoretical space that I do not spend much time in because the spending of time in it is not useful. But I'm not going to pretend they do not exist, because the honest version of this story includes the cost, and the cost was real. What I have is what I built. The investment group, the company, the structure that generates returns and gives me the kind of freedom that is not the freedom to do nothing. I have never wanted to do nothing. I was never the kind of person who builds toward leisure, but the freedom to choose what I do and with whom and on what terms, which is the only freedom that matters. I have colleagues who are good at what they do and who I respect. I have Lauren in the professional sense, which is a relationship that I value, without needing it to be something other than what it is. I have my notebooks, which are different now than they were, and not filled with the speculative architecture of things that don't yet exist, but with the detailed records of a person who has learned that the only truly reliable tool available to him is his own sustained attention. The person who built all of this is not the same person who would have built it if none of this had happened. That person would have been less patient, less precise about the difference between what things appear to be and what they actually are, less certain about the cost of building something visible when invisibility is what the situation requires, less clear about who is actually worth trusting and how to know it, which is the most practically important knowledge I carry, and which I would not have if I had not learned it the way I learned it. I won, and I am the person who won. And those are the same thing, and also very different things. And the living of it, the daily occupation of the space between those two facts, is what my life actually is, beneath everything that can be seen or measured or reported in any regional business magazine. Some mornings I wake up at 5 and run in the early streets before the city fills, and there is a particular quality to that hour, the emptiness of it, the sense of being awake in a space that belongs to no one particular, that I have valued since the years when it was the only hour I reliably had to myself. In those mornings, moving through the quiet streets, I feel something that is not triumph, and not peace, and not the absence of the past. It is something more accurate than any of those words, the steady, functional reality of a person who did a hard thing over a very long time, and paid the price the hard thing cost, and is now living in what comes after. That is all there is. That is enough. Stories like this happen more than you think. Someone right now is sitting in silence, building something the people who underestimated them will never see coming. Subscribe. The next story is already waiting.